Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey, welcome to the show. It's great to see you all. Let me push my little buttons here. There we go. Got my buttons pushed. Welcome. We've got a great show for you tonight. My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour, and I think you're going to like tonight's show. I have a little history of my own that's kind of having to do with the show. My family owned a house near Mount Shasta. We were about probably 25 miles away from Mount Shasta, and Mount Shasta reportedly has an alien base inside of it, and that has a little bit to do with what we're talking about tonight with Mr. Orion Musgrave Evans, in that cryptoterrestrial beings exist on the Earth, and he has had contact with them. So it's going to be interesting to talk about that tonight. But like I said, Mount Shasta is reportedly very wild with UAP and UFO sightings. And I remember I used to sit on my back porch and at night just to see if I could see any lights around Mount Shasta at night. But I never did. But I was hopeful, really hopeful. Anyway, my name is Charlotte, and I will be your host for the next hour. I also own and operate the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team, www.californiahaunts.org, out of Sacramento, California. We have people up and down the state of California, Washington, Oregon, and Nevada and Hawaii. And again, I want to thank you all for being here. If you want to see, if you want to see a copy of this radio show, you can pop over to www.californiahauntsradio.com. And that has all the archives, including the archive for tonight. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into our show because it's going to be a good one. Okay? Let me see how Ryan's doing. He's coming to us from Australia, by the way. So here we go. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, g'day. You can hear me properly?
Yes, sir.
Nice. How you been?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks
it's summer. It's summer where you're at, huh?
Yeah, well, it's on the way to be. Yeah, that's right. It's starting to warm up now.
See, we're in winter right now.
We're in spring. Yeah.
That's cool though.
Yeah, it's starting to warm up. It's getting. I don't know what it is. We do Celsius here, and I can't really think in Fahrenheit. I know you guys use Fahrenheit, but today it's probably about 23 degrees Celsius, just sort of warmish. But yeah, I've got the short sleeves on, so yeah, it's pretty warm here. So how's it going there weather-wise anyway?
It's going good. It's supposed to rain tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
So, we desperately need the rain, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, tell us about yourself, sir.
Yeah, well, I'm 42 years old, Australian. I live in the state of Victoria, which is in the extreme southeast of Australia. And I've lived in Victoria all my life. I've been an elementary school teacher for a fair few years there at one stage, a substitute. And for years as well, I was a nursery worker, like a tree farmer on wholesale tree nurseries. And I've also had a lot of weird paranormal experiences over my life, which is what we're talking about tonight, really. But really the paranormal stuff's sped up for me in the last few years when I moved back down to the Mornington Peninsula, which is where I came from. And that's when it really started arcing up.
Interesting. Did you find that it increased after you had your contact with these beings?
Yes. Well, it's been the same race of beings from what I can tell It worked out later on in more recent years that a lot of experiences I'd been having earlier in my life that I'd been attributing to fairies, elves, or tree spirits, or earth energy spirits of some kind. I'd been interpreting it along those lines when I was a kid, and then as a teenager, and also into my 20s, which sent me down a path of researching the Celtic fairy faith and druidry and neo-pagan earth religions and things like that. But in more recent times, I've been having experiences that are more really interpretable as being more clearly sort of UFO ET category like experiences. But the link is there. That it's been the same underlying race responsible for this all my life, but it's only now that that kind of aspect has shown itself more in the last 8 or so years. And cryptoterrestrial itself, that's a term that I got from the late great Mac Tonys, who were just a ufologist, futurist. He passed away quite young, only in his 30s, in the year 2009. But he had a book published posthumously called The Cryptoterrestrials, a meditation on indigenous humanoids and the aliens among us. And in that, he floated this hypothesis that maybe the beings behind the UFO, ET kind of phenomena that we have today, close encounter phenomena, are actually indigenous to this planet rather than being extraterrestrial. So he said that hypothetical race, he called it cryptoterrestrials, meaning hidden earthlings. He also suggested that these were probably the same beings as well that we've been interacting with for centuries or even millennia, and calling fairies, elves, earth spirits, jinn, depending on the cultural interpretation in different parts of the world. But that these non-human beings have been here for a very long time and are probably related to us due to their apparent interest in our genetics, which is an ongoing, theme in abduction law, that they seem to be wanting to either produce hybrids between us and them, or so that's where I got that name from, because I think that's probably the most appropriate term, the one that Mac Tonys came up with, cryptoterrestrial, or CT for brevity instead of ET, CT. But yeah, so Jacques Vallée and Mac Tonys very much have been big influences in the way I see these beings now.
When you think back to seeing the fairies and stuff, did you find that you were sensitive as a child? Had psychic abilities, or did you just one day go out in the yard and there they were?
Yeah, I've always had something that's maybe precognitive slightly. I've always had feelings like I'm remembering the future, where I already feel like this is familiar, and I've almost like a deja vu type of thing, I suppose, where I can read that something's about to happen because it's almost like I already remember it, that it already has happened, and then it does. That kind of thing, I've had a little bit of that over my whole life. But with the fairy stuff or the elf stuff, and when I say fairies or elves, I sort of use those words a bit interchangeably, but not really meaning like little ladies with wings or Santa's helpers at the North Pole and things like that, but more along the lines of the old Celtic and Teutonic fairy faiths that had these ideas that there were subterranean dwelling humanoid beings on the fringes of our world, and they are societal beings themselves that have their own occupations and just as we do, where they have teachers and soldiers and medics and all that kind of stuff. Using the words more along those lines. So, for instance, I've done a lot of research over the years. I did a lot of research into the Celtic fairy faith in particular, and read books like Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by W.Y. Evans Vance, and Robert Kirk, was writing in the 1600s, a Scottish minister that wrote The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. Some of the races described in those books and by those people, now I comprehend as being the same as what might be called tall whites nowadays in UFO lore. So, for instance, Nahuishlan, or the gentry, a
Mm-hmm.
certain race of fairy from Scotland and Ireland, was said to be tall, fair, subterranean dwelling, would whistle and chirp, could speak to you directly in your mind, could look like will-o'-wisp kind of glowing orbs, could still seem like a humanoid but suddenly glow and levitate. Was responsible for a lot of like poltergeist type phenomena, could become invisible. All of those characteristics and attributes Charles Hall applied to a group of beings he called tall whites, where he alleged that when he was posted at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, I think it's called Creech Air Force Base these days, but Nellis there, where Area 51 is supposed to be and all that. He claimed in the 60s that he was a weather observer there, and he'd venture out into the desert in Indian Springs with his theodolite so that he could release balloons and call back in the weather direction and speed and all that. He was there for 2 years, and while there, he had prolonged and regular interaction with a group of beings he decided to call tall whites, who are tall, fair, subterranean dwelling, whistle and chirp, speak to you directly in your mind, go through your things like poltergeist, all of the same characteristics. And so all of this stuff was really been piecing it together just over the past 10 years more than any other time. But so when I was younger, I would see beings, I would wake up in the middle of the night and not be able to wake the rest of my family. Feel like I should go outside, where I'd see tall, glowing white beings levitating and leaping into the air and floating back down again, things like this. Also, some dark beings with claws and glowing red eyes. Smaller beings galloping around on all fours like an antelope that were humanoid. And these are the guys that I've been having more interaction with of late. And they are the same, they're definitely the same race that Charles Hall interacted with. So when I came across Charles Hall's books, the Millennial Hospitality series of books, I was like, these are the same dudes. These are my dudes. Even down to the kind of mental manipulation and mental states that they'd enforce on Charles Hall when they are mesmerizing and also altering memory and things like that.
When you describe them, it's not how we think of alien beings at all.
Yeah, well, I suppose that the popular image, the most popular image today is, I suppose, of the grey, the 3 to 4 foot tall guy with the big head and the big black eyes. Those beings, from what I understand, or that idea, that popular understanding, is based on one or two races that do exist, but they're not the race that I have a lot of contact with. But from my understanding, there are only 4. There were only ever 4. So I know in ufology, lots of people disagree with me that are interested in the UFO scene, that say there's hundreds or there's dozens or whatever. 4. The ones that call themselves Mudgina, which are the tall whites. Another group that call themselves Sabetina, which are small, dark brown beings with black eyes, 3 ridges on the top of their head and claws. Another race that people usually call greys, that look similar to the Sabetina but a more grey color. And then another race again that are sometimes called greys, but they're a paler grey and they're more heavily built relatively, and they're a bit taller. They're more like 5 foot tall. So there's the 4. And what happens is the Mudgina wear what I call a boas suit a lot of the time. A lot of time, if people have interaction with a tall white, they won't look like a tall white really, because well, they'll either be cloaking and completely invisible, but if they are visible, they have what I call a boas suit, named after Antonio Vilas Boas, who was an abductee in Brazil, who saw them wearing these suits, dark grey or black when they're not cloaking, with goggles that glow red at night, with a large nose piece that hangs down on the front of their face, and a breathing device, and prosthetic claws on their fingers. With these suits, they can be intangible, so they can pass through solid objects, they can levitate, they can cloak. They have telepath technology in their helmets. And these, I think, are what often people might call tall black aliens, or call sometimes when people are seeing those, they say they're reptilians, but they're just another presentation of the tall whites. So in my opinion, the tall whites are responsible for a lot of these sort of false understandings about multiple races out there. Another one, in my opinion, is Mantis Beings. So I've had a lot of interaction with these beings in more sort of social interactions where they've visited or have been taken away, or also more sort of like old-fashioned, typical medical procedure type interactions, in which case a lot of them then wear dark black lenses on their eyes, like they're some kind of smart lens or medical lens, I'm presuming. A cap over their head and hair, a thing over their face and mouth so that you can only see the top part of their face. They have very long hands, thin hands. They'll wear gloves. These are their medics. 4 long fingers with a very small vestigial thumb further up their hand. The 4 fingers can spread out apart each other and opposable. So that's how they hardly ever use their thumb. Their thumb's sort of vestigial. And the taller beings can get to 7, 8, 9, or even 10 foot tall, the really old ones. And when they get that tall, it seems to impact upon their stature, their spine. They're really hunched looking with their shoulders projecting forward, with their neck coming almost straight out of their chest at a weird angle when they get quite old. And those ones are quite often their medics and look like a mantis. They look like a praying mantis or something like that. And so when I've seen that, I've thought, that kind of looks, when they're like dressed like that, they look kind of like an insect. So then I went online and I was like, praying mantis, but mantis beings, mantoids. And a lot of drawings were coming up of beings that basically look a lot like what I've seen, but people are saying they're a separate race, whereas it's just another occupation or another manner of dress. So there's a lot of confusion, I think, in ufology about that, where these 4 real races have given rise to belief in hundreds of different races, depending on how they present themselves at the time.
What comes to mind is the caves they found, allegedly found above the Grand Canyon, where they found the bones from the tall people.
Oh, okay, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, and the story goes that somebody reported to the Smithsonian. Smithsonian went in, and these bones disappeared. They don't know what happened to them.
Oh, wow, okay, yeah.
And so as you talk about this, that's a good possibility.
Yeah. Well, some ideas about giants and bones that have been found that are far too tall for us. And then you hear a lot of rumors about that kind of thing, conspiracy ideas about the Smithsonian Institute being one of the culprits, covering up a lot of stuff when it comes to remains that don't quite go along with the typical story narrative that they'd like you to believe. But I think these guys, for so long, they've been responsible for birthing sort of like characters from mythology and religion and folklore for centuries and centuries and centuries. And not just elves and fairies, but a lot of people's understandings about angels and demons, I think, stem from this as well. Especially the sort of more pop culture idea of what people think of an angel. They think of like a fair being that's levitating and glowing with white hair maybe and beautiful big blue eyes. And then I think of a demon and I'll think of a growling, snarling, dark, clawed, red-eyed creature. Both of these are the same race, dressed in different ways. They bark and they growl. That's part of their camouflage languages. They have their own language, which I've heard multiple times. Their own language you can listen to if you listen to the Sierra Sounds. I get into a bit of trouble talking to people about this as well, because that is universally interpreted as being, if it's real, Sasquatch.
Right.
But that is definitely tall whites using their own native language. Sounds like a cross between like Japanese and Korean or something like that.
Right.
But they also mix in like camouflage codes, artificial codes that are based on mimicking wildlife, and they'll bark and they'll growl and yelp. They'll scream and make bird-like noises, and fox-like noises, and sort of like like foxes sometimes when they sort of almost sound like they're laughing and sort of like chattering sounds. I believe like coyotes like sounds and things like that as well. And anyone who's read Charles Hall's Millennial Hospitality books will be very familiar with the way he described some of the sounds of their languages. He considered those sounds to be their natural language, but that's more like a camouflage system. Their actual natural language sounds much more like our natural languages, and in particular sounds, like I said, like an East Asian language of some
Yes.
kind, but it isn't. Of course, that's a coincidence, but it hits our ears like that. Probably if a Japanese or a Korean person heard it, they wouldn't think it sounded like Japanese or Korean at all. But to Westerners like us, we hear it and go, oh, it's like that. But I actually, I'm sort of sorry, I'm sort of wandering off here a little bit, but
It's okay.
the guy, can you remember the Al Berry and Ron Moorhead? Sorry, there, yeah.
Ron Moorhead,
Al Berry and Ron
Yeah.
Moorhead recorded the sounds in the early 70s in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I contacted Ron Moorhead and said to him, hey, dude, I reckon these are real, but they're not Sasquatch, Bigfoot, that it's tall whites. Have you ever heard of Charles Hall's books, blah, blah, blah? And he sent me a message back saying, well, I might be right. He doesn't know what made the sounds. All he knows is that they definitely had very big feet, which is why he sort of calls it Bigfoot, because they found they couldn't see them. They could only hear them, even when they were close enough that they should have been able to see them, which suggests this cloaking. Making all these sounds, and then also making sounds that sounded like poltergeist sounds, trashing their camp. But then they get up in the morning and nothing will have been touched, which is sort of more typical, like tall white behavior as well. They do that kind of stuff, poltergeist stuff, but then not necessarily produce any lasting impact and damage. He also heard humming coming from in the mountain, and also I think from the tops of the trees and things. That's another typical suggestion that there's an underground habitation of theirs nearby, a repeated thing through different cases. And then also he saw evidence of high technology, like orbs, glowing lights, and like something that he said looked like the blade of a lightsaber going across the surface of the earth. Craft. And so he said to me, yeah, look, he doesn't know what did it. He's never claimed that he knew what was making the sounds,
Right.
other than to say that they left very big tracks. Well, you see tall whites, especially the older ones, have huge feet. And the size of their tracks was commented on in the Skinwalker Ranch case as well, because these are the same guys behind Skinwalker Ranch. They have a habitation there under the ground. The Gorman family, that's a pseudonym, but anyway, the ranchers that were there at Skinwalker Ranch, when they said they saw the RV, that described them as like a recreational vehicle, an RV type craft, or maybe nowadays people would be more inclined to say a Tic Tac because of all the stuff in the media, but they'd see them floating over their property, landing, taking off, and the woman, the wife, saw a giant come out of one, a huge man dressed in black. And then in the morning when they went there, they found the footprints, and it's just massive footprints. I can't remember how big they said they were, but very, very. So they leave huge footprints, and this is their language, and one of the ways they can, it's the subterfuge. Like they're incredibly smart. They have had centuries and millennia to work out ways to manipulate our minds through robust technologies. They can run circles around us. Usually, if we know they're there, it's because they've let us. They don't normally make mistakes, although I think they do occasionally. But yes, there it is. Yeah.
In your encounters with them, have they been peaceful with you, or have you been roughed up, or?
They've been peaceful with me, although some of them are very frightening, especially early on when I was a kid. And also, just about 8 years ago, when they started happening again, was more frightened, and then sort of had gotten used to it. But they can rough people up. They can be, it depends on the kind of person you are and whether or not they decide that you're worth interacting with, and also what your motivations are, if you're a threat to them in some way. It's my understanding that some of the missing 411 cases are attributable to them. especially in the cases of hunters,
Mm-hmm.
because if they perceive someone to be of aggressive and malicious intent, to have a deadly weapon, to be in an area where they are present, and they're not necessarily always present in different areas. They have habitations all over the earth, but they have them, and they travel they chase the warmth. They'll travel around the world and sort of chase the summer for them,
Mm-hmm.
even though sometimes there'll be like skeleton crews in places that don't have many that are a bit colder. But if they are in a place and their children are playing and there's hunters around in a state or national park and there's weapons being used, they have killed people. Especially if it's a spur of the moment kind of thing where they break through cover. Maybe there's a hunter that
Mm-hmm.
thinks it's an animal, goes to shoot, and that's the end of them. They're dead. These kinds of things can and do happen. They have a strong understanding as well of kind of like death for a death, eye for an eye, life for a life, and all that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So if one of them is injured or killed, they don't mess about. But on the other side, they have a priestly class, and some members of their group are highly spiritual and what we would call to be incredibly compassionate individuals. So they run the whole gamut of different kinds of personalities, just as we do. And their military is particularly ruthless, or can be. They have a highly stratified military, highly organized, traditional warrior class, and as you can imagine, just in our militaries, the soldiers themselves, perhaps, but even more the people running the show, are not necessarily the most compassionate, understanding individuals that represent Homo sapiens. So yeah, they can be lethal. They can be dangerous if they perceive you as a threat, for sure.
Well, they must have been around for centuries because I mean, when you look back, even in the Bible, there's reports of giants and stuff. And I mean, even the Greek mythology, with all the gods, being gigantic. So these guys, this population must go way back.
I think so. Yeah, a very 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 long time, millennia. I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're responsible for, if not all, most of our spiritual belief systems and superstitions and understandings about the nature of sort of non-human entities in the world, like gods and spirits, and even just down to ghosts. What we'd normally think of as being, the spirits of deceased individuals.
Right.
A lot of that kind of stuff. I'm not saying all of it. I mean, maybe there are ghosts that are deceased people that are going around shaking windows and playing tricks on people, or constantly reliving an element of their life over and over again, or their own death or whatever. But I think most of the kinds of phenomena that are normally attributed to that kind of thing are them. Even Kirk, back in the 1600s when he was writing his book about them, he made that observation then. He said that poltergeist activity and people playing tricks on you, invisible beings playing tricks on you in domestic places, is the elves, or what he called subterranean inhabitants, not ghosts or demons or this, that, and the other. And I agree, today it's still the case. You hear, and that's like, if someone says to me that they've seen a UFO, I think that's cool. If someone says to me they've spoken to an ET, I go, okay, that's pretty cool. Maybe true, might not be true.
Uh-huh.
But if someone says to me that their house is haunted, that they wake up in the middle of the night and there's disembodied voices, there's music playing, there's people laughing, there's a dark shape moving around, there's poltergeist activity happening, I think, you're an ET experiencer. That's normal. That's more the way that ET or CT experiences manifest. People thinking that they're being haunted. Even if you don't see UFOs or anything like that, and you've got that kind of stuff happening, you very well might they have some involvement with you.
Well, I've said this before on other shows, and that after reading the people that got abducted, the couple that got abducted in the Mojave.
Oh yeah.
and the report, the after effects of what happened, it made me question, as a ghost hunter, it made me question what exactly we're making contact with. Because the way they describe it is these beings are just floating through the walls, just like, just like a typical ghost would, and the different things like that. So it really made me wonder about, are the EVPs we getting actually the deceased, or are these these this other race, like you're talking about? Because when you think about some of those, sometimes those EVPs can sound mechanical. They're really like way off, like another dimension or whatever. So it really, like you're saying, it really makes you wonder, as far as the whole ghost thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's my belief that most of that is them. And if they've decided, like recently, George Knapp and Colm Kelleher wrote a new book recently, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, which I read just the other week. They're talking about, they're talking a lot about the hitchhiker effect, where people that have been to Skinwalker Ranch, say, or have taken an interest even in it, and are researching about it, can and do have things following them home, and they'll start to have the kinds of things we're talking about: poltergeist activity, disembodied voices, things talking to them through the radio, this kind of stuff. And sometimes it can be fairly benign, and may even seem accidental. Like someone will wake up and see a shape, whoop-de-doo, that there's nothing much there. Or sometimes it can be sort of like a focused and more malicious, aggressive, intimidatory kind of behavior. And I think that is simply them investigating people that are investigating them. So it's if you go to someone where they've had a habitation, you're interested in them, they'll take an interest in you. They'll go back to your life. Colm Kelleher talks about that being, perhaps you can understand this kind of thing as like a contagion as well. It can be modeled in like it's a contagious agent. Not that it's literally a virus, but you can model it and understand it in those terms. And that someone goes to Skinwalker Ranch, they take something home with them, their friends and family who have no direct connection to Skinwalker Ranch will suddenly be seeing weird stuff as well. You could look at it, it's a similar kind of process to perhaps like one of our intelligence agencies deciding that there's a person of interest that they think might be a threat, and looking at their social media and investigating and gleaning as much as they can from them, and then expanding the search to their friends and family, and then to theirs, and so on. And it ends up this major surveillance thing. Well, I think that's an echo of that kind of thing. And how intimidating and frightening it is, and how much of a malignant force it is, depends on the motivation of the people originally. Because a lot of those people that are getting like Bob Bigelow and whatnot, is getting financed by the Department of Defense. And, it's not just defense, it's offense, here there's this in the back of their mind, there's this idea that they're discerning what kind of threat that the paranormal activity or the ETs might pose to them, but also is there some kind of way that they can weaponize any of their own discoveries they make and this kind of stuff. So there's this, it's a questionable motivation in the first place for some of this investigation at Skinwalker Ranch. And I think the Mudgeonner themselves, the Tall Whites themselves, understand this very well. And some of the attention is just not welcome, for those reasons. But there are other investigatory groups that aren't posing threats to the Tall Whites, or planning on using what they discover to their advantage in some kind of offensive or defensive way. And they get along famously with the Mudgeonner, or seem to be. Trey Hudson, who's written a book called The Meadow Project, Skinwalker Ranch in the South, or something like that. He hasn't specified where it is because he doesn't want people trampling over the place and stuff.
Right.
But he and his group have been having interactions with these same beings as well, near an underground habitation, I presume, the way they behave towards them. And it does get a little bit scary, apparently, but it's not malignant in that same kind of way. And that's because Trey Hudson and his group don't have the kind of motivations that maybe NIDS might have, or some other group. But anyway.
Um, with your encounters, did the encounters with them start out slow, and then as they got to know you and realized that they were meeting with you, did the encounters increase?
Uh, yeah. Well, I think so it was sort of peppered over my life, sort of different encounters with
Mm-hmm.
them, but nothing too major. And then, about 8 or so years ago, I had this major event where I woke up and I was out on our porch, like out on our veranda.
Wow.
Um, and I was like, whoa, I'm not supposed to be here. It's like all of a sudden I came to. And I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking, and I'd also been like, I had this vague understanding there at one stage that I was like lining up drinking glasses and sorting coins, which was strange, on the table. And then I
Mm-hmm.
thought, I'm going back inside. And as I went to go back inside, I started levitating and I went up around the roof of the veranda. And then, boom, I was in a bed. And there was a woman sitting on the bed beside me with huge blue eyes. And it felt like she was projecting like comfort.
Mm-hmm.
There was this tall male that I felt to be a male, dressed in the medic kind of gear. Opened my mouth, felt around on all my teeth, like they were checking and counting my teeth. Or then he wandered around behind my head and lifted my head and performed this incredibly painful procedure on the base of my skull, where the vertebrae goes into the skull. I've never felt anything that painful in my life, but all the while I felt like I was calm,
Mm-hmm.
even though the pain wasn't masked, it was still there. Um, and then there was a scan over the top of me, and then like lots of different images flashing across my eyes, so that I couldn't really see out of my eyes, but there was all these images. And then they returned me, boom, back into bed, and I got up, went to the bathroom, felt like there was still a presence in the house. That major contact event was the beginning of a lot of stuff that's been happening to me since then. So that was uh, about 2013, I think it was, or 2014 maybe, because we had these baby gates up, and so I think my son at the time would have been about 2, so I can sort of work it out like that. But I don't keep journals, so unfortunately, it doesn't do much for my credibility sometimes. But I can't quite remember sometimes when things came first with some of these experiences. But
Right.
um, but after that, yeah, then they really escalated. Where I invited them to come into my house and not as well, and not be not just like I thanked them for allowing me to remember things,
Mm-hmm.
because they said to me as well, we apologize for the mesmerization. We apologize for the memory alteration. So they're terms now that I use when I'm talking about this kind of stuff, because they're the words and terms they use
Mm-hmm.
themselves to me in English when they're describing what they're doing. Um, but I asked them, instead of just allowing me to remember medical procedures, now could they come and have a beer with me, or a coffee, or a tea, and come and visit. So I suppose you'd call that a CE5, a close encounter
Right.
of the fifth kind, because it's human initiated or whatever. Um, and then it was soon after that, I don't know if it was the next day or a couple of days later, I was in my kitchen talking to my wife, who I thought was my wife at the time. Uh, but standing there, lights on at night in the kitchen, and she was leaning against like the kitchen bench, kitchen counter.
Mm-hmm.
I was on the other side of the kitchen table. We were both standing. We were talking about something, and I can't remember the topic. We were talking and engaged in conversation and getting along quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And it could have gone for anywhere between 10 minutes or an hour. I'm not sure the passage of time. Um, and then I started to feel a bit weird in my head, and I dropped down onto my knees and crawled out of the kitchen and grabbed socks out of this laundry basket and started rolling them up and putting them in lines, like it's like an obsessive compulsive kind of thing, like I'd
Right.
been doing the other time with the glasses. Then I started levitating, was put back in bed over the top of my wife, who was still asleep and had been the whole time, dropped onto the bed, didn't even have time to lie down, dropped back onto the bed, was completely awake again, and heard a, a female voice right in the center of my mind say, "We just had a date." And then I felt adrenaline just shoot through me as I started to panic. And then she said, "I roll my eyes at you." And then I heard footsteps through the house, the front door open and close, and then footsteps up the driveway. And then no presence anymore. She was gone. And I took the second sentence to be sort of like a mild rebuke, like saying to me, like, you should know better than to be that frightened by now. Because I had
Wow.
a fearful reaction. She said, "I roll my eyes at you." but it was a direct response, I think, to my invitation. And she jokingly called it a date, because I'd invited her to the house. And when I thought back, so it's kind of like a screen memory, but I could penetrate through it. So at the time, I thought it was my wife, but when I thought back, I was like, this was a woman, at least 6 foot tall, incredibly thin, with a black suit on, with a darker black, like circular kind of technology on her chest, short white hair, huge blue eyes, with her arms crossed, leaning against the kitchen sink. And after that event, then I had more interactions that were similar, with people actually coming to my house. A guy that calls himself Joe or Joseph, that has really tight, white, fuzzy hair sticking out the back of his head a bit. He's probably about 5'6" or something like that. He said he's 80 years old. He's a soldier of some kind. Another one that calls herself Branu. She claims to be the same individual that Charles Hall called the teacher. I believe her. I don't know why she'd bother lying to me about that. Another individual called Butterfly, who's only about 5 foot tall. She wears wigs when she comes, and makeup and things like that, and long gloves. Like she's trying to dress more like we do, or cover up the strange elements of her. A female guard called Sibylline. And so there's certain particular individuals that come and visit me or take me away. But it's become much more personable. It was more sort of business oriented and sort of medical procedures and things like that, until I gave that invitation to them.
That's incredible. What does your wife say about all this?
She was the first person I ever told about it, and that was years ago now. But it had already been, like, after that major event of me going up around the roof of the veranda. Oh, and I'll add another thing to that as well. The next day, right where I'd gone up over the roof, is our television antenna is up there, and it was all twisted around, right where I would have gone over. And at the time, I thought, oh, maybe I'd struck it as I went past it.
Right.
But investigating it since, I've found that that's something that can happen when these anti-gravitic craft are parked over a house. The forces used can sort of like twist and rip up antennas and things like that. So I think that's what happened there. But after that event, it could have been a couple of years. I was having these experiences and stuff. Could have been a couple of years before I even told my wife. And she was just sort of like, that I'm probably nuts. She's sort of like, oh, whatever. She's bought a broken one. But after a few years, she sort of was more interested in it, especially gathering the information for the book and writing the book. She can see that a lot of this can't possibly be a coincidence with a lot of stuff I go into, demonstrating, like, pictures I've drawn. Things have been found later on that match them and things like this. But like, for instance, the boa suit helmets that they wear with the nose piece and this section that goes up over their forehead and things. Trey Hudson and his research group at the Meadow found like a totem, a rock wedged between the trunks of two trees. That is a totem that's a carving of one of them, with the same nose, the shape to the nose that flares out, and all this. And I did drawings of these things years ago, the things that I've been seeing. So my wife sort of sees these things now and goes, hold on a sec, maybe he's telling the truth. She's had her own experiences as well, but much less intense. And my children have as well. My son's seen, but I don't really talk to them about it, because I don't want them to be frightened, and also, I don't like front loading my kids with it as well, to say, oh, I've seen this, I've seen that, and then they say they've seen the same thing, because they're maybe sort of basing some of their nightmares on stuff I'm saying and things. But when they come up to me and say, oh, I saw this, I've seen this, I had this weird dream, I think, oh, okay, that's interesting. Then it's a possibility. It's more likely to have actually been something based in reality or whatever. But yeah, my wife, yeah, she's happy enough now, but I think she thought it was a bit unfortunate at first.
How long do these when you come in contact with them, when they take you, how long do the voyages or trips take?
Hours sometimes. I think elements I'll have missing time as well, so I don't understand some of the things that have transpired. I'll only remember points where I'll so for instance, I was underground somewhere. I ended up deciding that it was, when I came back to the surface, that it was probably somewhere in the Victorian high country, or maybe it was even in Tasmania, just by the kinds of trees that were there and the kind of the look of the world. But I was underground, and there were Mudgeon, their tall whites dressed in their boa suits, these dark suits, walked me up to a table of people, of Homo sapiens. And there was a group of people already there arguing with each other. And I started arguing with a guy sitting at the head of the table, because he was talking about the nature of one of the groups, and I was saying, "Oh, you got that wrong. You're conflating two different races together," or something. I can't remember what it was. I was having this argument with this guy, and then the Mudgeon got us all to stand up and to leave. And as we were walking out and we started coming back out the ramp, I was saying to the people that were there with me, the Homo sapiens people, you can see them, can't you? You can see them as they're walking along with us. And they were getting quite afraid. Like they didn't want to look. And I just thought it was the most wonderful thing. My reaction is not fear anymore. And we came out into a forest, out of the ground into a forest where there was one of these Tic Tac or RV type craft. Now, I'm not sure how long I'd been away, but I knew that I needed to go to the bathroom. Okay, so we got on board, and this is the interesting thing about some of their craft as well. They're made out of they're fabricated from elements from our own industry. So they do have craft in their fleet that have like grown organic vehicles, grown in zero G, that respond to your thoughts and are more like people hear about this kind of thing a lot in UFO lore, that their ships can be sentient or bioengineered in some way. There are some like that they have, but most of them have been used relying on our own industries. So, and then they'll use our relatively inferior materials and technologies with their superior science and use it to incredible effect. So with these anti-gravity craft and things like that, so you've got this what looked like a little white bus with windows along the side, with a door that opened up on the side. I got in, and the seats are just bus seats, just like we'd have. The pilot seats look like maybe they're out of our fighter jets, but made out of segments, not grown as a single piece. And so I got on there with the other people, the Homo sapiens, and there was a Homo sapiens guy there, like an usher, who was telling us to come on, but the pilots were Mudgeon, tall whites. And then I was going to say to the guy, I need to go to the bathroom. Can I just go behind the trees here or something? And I went to say it, and he was closing the door. So then I was sitting there, and I was thinking, this is going to be uncomfortable if this journey's too long. And then I swapped seats and started reading like a flyer they had on the back of one of the seats. And then, boom, I woke up in bed with a really full bladder, like a considerable amount of time since that point had even passed. But that I had a memory loss for that element. So I think that journey would have been hours. And by the time, and it was sunrise, when it was just starting to be sunrise when we were getting on the craft. And then by the time I was home and felt really uncomfortable and needed to go to the bathroom, the sun was up considerably further than that. But it felt like the place seemed to be like somewhere up in the high country, in the mountains in Victoria, the state where I live, or maybe even Tasmania has similar flora and things like that. But yeah, for a long time sometimes.
There's a story that I either read or heard from somebody about a little boy who somebody was driving in a pickup truck, and found this little boy in the woods. And when he took the little boy in, to give him food and stuff, the little boy told him that he had been taken by what he called fairy folk underground. And he had actually met other little children underground. And they had made, I don't know, I guess they were planning to do something sinister to him or something. But for some reason, they let him go.
Okay.
And that's when this guy found him wandering around. I mean, I did some research on your stuff too, and like you say, is that they live underground. They live in mountains. They live under the ocean. How do you know about the ocean part?
Well, they told me. Well, they said that
Okay.
they have a major habitation under Bass Strait as well, like in the continental shelf between between Victoria and Tasmania, like the mainland of Australia and Tasmania, that they are in the continental shelf under that, and just around the world in general, they have that kind of thing, and they exit and enter the ocean even to get to other places that are on dry land sometimes as well, because they're much less likely to be interference or to be seen when they're doing that kind of thing. But and they can, some of their ships, like the more advanced of their ships, can do this intangibility kind of thing, which they can do in their suits as well. So they can fly straight into the side of mountains as well without need for a door. But some of their craft aren't that sophisticated. It depends on whether they've made them elsewhere out of materials elsewhere, because the reason my book is called Children of Orion, Finding the Cryptoterrestrials, that might sound like a bit of a contradiction, because if they're indigenous to this planet, what do they have to do with Orion, which is a extrasolar constellation, of course. But it is that they are a kind of future lineage human, but that depends on what you mean by time travel. You could maybe even call them interdimensional. They're from another universe. They have unraveling genomic structures. They need our DNA. They need to interbreed with us on occasion to reinforce their own dying genetics. And they have come back. They have come to a planet, a version of an ancient Earth that to them was archaic and ancient. So we are like ancient versions of them, and we are like free-range ancient humans to them, that they can take genes from, and they have a lot of maladies and pathologies. Their bodies take a long time to heal. They can succumb to certain kinds of diseases and be quite sickly. They can live to advanced ages if they're lucky, to as long as 700 to 800 years, but because of their fragility in other ways, they're very mortal. And when they're not wearing their suits, they can be injured and killed very easily by one of us or by one of our animals, like a dog. So they're particularly nervous around dogs, domesticated dogs. Yeah, they sorry, what was the question? I'm rambling now. I've drifted away from what you were asking. Sorry, Charlotte.
I can't remember. I'm just fascinated by what you're saying. You're drawing me in so much. I'm just like, wow.
I think I was just branching off for a second, then I forgot what the main point was. Sorry,
but it's all good. It's all good. I have a question in the chat room. Says, what are these? What are these peoples called?
What are they called? They're usually, in ufology, they're normally called tall whites.
Okay.
From Charles Hall's book.
Right.
But they're the same beings that kidnapped Antonio Villas-Boas in Brazil in 1957. Even though those particular individuals weren't that tall, they take a long time to grow. So tall whites is a misnomer, really, because they could take 100 years to even reach 6 foot. They can get to heights of like 10 foot by the time they get to 700 or 800 years old. But if you've got an individual like the individuals that Antonio Villas-Boas came across, were only about 5 foot tall, they're probably going to be about 50 or 60 years old, like 5060, not 15 or 16. So they take a long time to grow. So they were tall whites as well, barking, growling, but not very tall. They call themselves Majena, and I made up a spelling for that to reflect what they've said to me they are called. And I just spell it Majeena, but I suppose you could spell it any way you like because I just made that up. They have they they are the Wandjina. It's the same word, I believe. What the Wandjina in Australia, the pictographs, the ancient pictographs from the Kimberley, of the white beings with huge eyes, with the weird noses and things like that. So Wandjina is Mudjina. It's the same thing. That's what they call themselves. Before Charles Hall's books came out in the early 2000s, I believe people used to call them Nordics more often in the old days. That word sort of spread out into the community. And nowadays, people make a distinction between tall whites and Nordics and say, oh, no, tall whites are what Charles Hall knew. Nordics are beings that look more like us, look like Scandinavian supermodels or something like that, you know.
Right.
But that wasn't the case earlier on, where earlier on there wasn't the term tall whites. And there were only 4 races. One of them, the Mudjina, because they're tall with white or blonde hair and blue eyes, they were known by the intelligence community as a slang way of referring to them, Nordics. And that word's crept out into the community, and now it's sort of misused. So Nordics and tall whites are originally the same thing. And they don't really look like Scandinavians. I mean, their facial structure is more like what we consider to be like a pop culture version of an elf, but their ears aren't very obvious. Their ears are less obvious than ours. They have really small ears, not just holes. There is structure, but less than ours. Some of them have noses that are hardly there at all, really. Some of them have sort of more definition to their noses and a bit more of a bridge and length. Eyes that are much larger than ours and are blue, but when the males get to about 400 years old, their iris starts to turn pink, and as they get older, the older male tall whites have pink eyes, not blue. Sometimes you'll see them with black eyes because they're medics, and they have long pointed faces, and as they get older and older, they start off as kids with quite short heads. As their bodies get longer and elongate, their faces do as well, and they end up when they're older, they have really big, long, pointed chins. And Peter Curry, the Australian experiencer from Sydney, he's been a lifelong experiencer, but the main case that most people think of when they think of Peter Curry is the 1992 encounter, where he woke up to a tall white woman sitting on him, and this was he was in their breeding program, obviously. He said she was about 7 foot tall or so. And he said she had a chin like a witch. That's how he described it. He said it like a pointed chin like a witch. That's quite typical of them when they get old like that. And they have quite high cheekbones. And there's a lot of room for variability. Like there's these, people look at my channel, you'll see. It's not actually in my book, but it will be in my second book. But if you go to my channel, which is just my name, Ryan Musgrave Evans, I've made a video about it, but there's these 3 photos that have been floating about online for a little bit. Not very long, I don't think. No one knows what they are, but they are Mudjina. I'm tall whites. I'm very sure. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 90-something% sure. These 3 individuals are photos, front-on photos that look like they were taken a fair while ago, a bit of a grainy look to them or whatever, but wearing tight helmets. And you can see, it's their portraits sort of, you can see their neck and a bit of their shoulders maybe, and their faces. And then also I've done a lot of sketches and drawings of them myself over the last couple of years. And you can compare and look at what my drawings of them and these actual photos of them. They're quite similar. So they basically look like what you'd think an elf would look like, a real elf, but without the ears. Otherwise, very much like that.
Whoa. Question in the chat room. Are there reptilians that live underground?
Well, I don't think so. I personally don't believe in the reptilian stuff. In my opinion, what reptilians are is a misunderstanding of the different beings that do exist, the 4 beings that exist. Tall whites, when they're wearing their dark suits and wearing fake claws with goggles and glowing red eyes and things like that, can sort of look like reptilians maybe. But the other races, they have scales, and real claws. All three of them, all three of the other races kind of look like reptiles. They're future lineage humans. They're not reptiles, they're mammals, but they have a kind of a scaly look. One of them has sort of like the look like the underbelly of a snake or a lizard, sort of a pearly white look to one version of one group. The group that Steve Boucher was abducted by, that's one kind of group. They sort of look a bit like Megamind. They've got really big heads. They've got pale skin, sort of a little bit of a scaly look to them, and a little bit of a claw-like thing. But then the other group that's got darker skin, grey, heavier scales, longer claws, big black eyes, whereas the Steve Boucher aliens still had whites to their eyes. The big black eyes. And then another one again that has dark brown skin, that has 3 ridges on their head. These are the Virginia incident beings from Brazil from the 90s. The little brown creatures, claws, they kind of look like a monkey reptile. It's about 3 or 4 foot tall. So a lot of them look like reptiles, and I think that's where that's begun.
Maybe that's yeah.
And then people have gotten really carried away with it, and then gone, oh, there's actual big dragon-like lizards and all that kind of stuff. They're from Draco and all this kind of stuff. I'm skeptical about that kind of thing. Some people say, I shouldn't throw rocks when I'm in a glass house. I'm making all these weird claims, and then I'm suggesting other people are wrong. But I have to say it the way I see it. I see most of the folklore of ufology as it is online. Easily 90% of it or more is being fake. There aren't that many people out there that are genuine experiences that know that they're cryptoterrestrial experiences.
Sure.
There are a lot of people who are experiencers and don't know, and may just think their house is haunted. And they might, people like Steve Boucher, Chris Bledsoe, Charles Hall, the guy that wrote Devil's Den, Terry Lovelace. These people, they're definitely telling the truth. Peter Curry, Callie Cale from Australia. And then there are a lot of other people that are telling the truth too. If I left someone off the list, doesn't necessarily mean I don't believe them. But just off the top of my head, those people I definitely believe in. But as soon as people start talking about, and this makes me fairly unpopular in ufology, but whatever. As soon as people start talking about Palladian, tall Scandinavian supermodels from the Pleiades, or big dragon lizard things from Draco, or mantis beings, when they're actually talking about them as being really insects from some other planet that they know about, things like that, I go, nah, if you're seeing mantis beings, you're most likely just seeing very old, tall, tall whites. So I make all these claims myself, fair enough, but I'm actually very closed-minded.
Well, I have one last question for you. Is why are they here? Are they here to improve their species by mating with us? Because like you talk about the ones that have the blue eyes, and again you go back to the Scandinavian models. So is that what they're doing? They're trying to improve themselves by crossing with us?
Yeah, but that's the main reason they came back here to ancient versions of themselves, to us, is because there's a few different reasons why. There's been natural mutations that were not positive, but for the most part, their genetic systems are corrupt through deliberate genetic engineering. So deliberate attempts to alter their own DNA and lengthen their own lifespans. Like the human genome is a holistic, systemic thing. And if you decide that you are going to make certain changes to it in a conscious, deliberate way, there's going to be all these unforeseen side effects and symptoms you hadn't banked on. And that's what has happened to them. They've lengthened their lifespans. They've made other tinkering alterations in their systems. And they've basically messed themselves up. They can't repair it themselves. They've been trying to. They've decided the only way they can do it is return to a time before humans started trying to influence their own DNA. So people might think, oh, that doesn't sound right, because we're on the cusp of understanding the human genome and maybe removing cancer, removing disease, lengthening our lives and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's the kind of thinking that got them into trouble in the first place. So we're all poised to make the very mistakes now that they already did. And they're desperately trying to fix their own maladies and pathologies, and they haven't worked out how to do it other than a constant replenishing of reintegration of our genes into theirs with each generation. Now, they're also a very proud people. They don't want to look like us.
Right.
They want certain elements of our genetic, like solidity and density to our muscles, and resistance to certain diseases, and our healing rate, and these kinds of things. But they don't actually necessarily find us physically appealing, and they would prefer to remain looking as much like themselves as they can. So the idea of them producing half and half hybrids with us is not really a thing that happens, I don't think.
Okay.
You do sometimes hear of darker skinned individuals associating with what normally would be considered to be tall whites or something like that. Like, for instance, in the Peter Curry case, the woman that was sitting on him was a tall white, more typically, but there was another woman sitting on the bed next to him that he said had more of an Asian appearance, but still had her eyes were still too big and things like that. So maybe that kind of thing does happen, where sometimes they do sometimes take on some appearances, but for the most part, I think they don't. So when they interbreed with us, like they did with Curie or with Antonio Villas-Boas or with lots of people around the world, they don't necessarily want the progeny to be 50-50. They're still going to tinker with it a bit. So they're sort of sitting on the fence. They want to be natural. They're trying to reproduce a naturalness and use our genes, but at the same time, they're also trying to maintain a certain kind of older way that because they're proud, so they still want to seem still to be themselves in some way. Because you'd think the best way for them to do things, you'd think, why don't they just teach some of us their culture and language and histories and let themselves die out and just be completely replaced with a new generation of us instead of still trying to mix themselves into the mix. But they don't want to do that. They want to retain something of themselves genetically and all that.
Makes sense. You also, real quick, said that they can manipulate our thoughts in that, like you were talking about, their spacecraft, they can make them appear as like a helicopter to us.
Yeah, they can do that kind of thing. Yes. Yeah, they can, and there's a few different cases where this has been described to abductees or contactees by the tall whites. In the Averley case, famous case from Britain from the 70s, a couple were taken on board, drove into a mist, and then were taken on board a craft with tall, fair beings with pink eyes, because they were about 6.5 foot tall, which would make them about 400 years old. So they should have pink eyes, and they did have pink eyes instead of blue. And they told them a fair few different things, like their future versions of us. But they also said, sorry, what was the question again? I'm rambling again.
Just to be able to manipulate our minds, in what we see, like you.
Yes. So they told, they told him. Yeah. They expressed to him that kind of thing. They said the craft, they can make it appear so that the world behind it is projected onto it to cloak it.
Okay.
So it looks like you can see through it or whatever you're seeing. But they can also make it look like anything, like a helicopter, like a plane, a jet, and reproduce the sounds even and things like that. Seems to be something that they can do. But they can also mess with your mind as well. And I think and make you think that you're seeing something that it does not actually physically appear to be at all, which I think is the more common thing that they do when they're interacting with you one-on-one. They're not actually morphing themselves. If they make themselves, like the one that made herself look like my wife, so like a doppelganger of my wife,
right?
That was her mesmerization and an illusion born of just telepathy.
Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
This was really cool. Really cool. I would love to get you on again and talk to you more about this stuff, because this is just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, Charlotte. Yeah, that's
Okay.
been good fun. Yeah, we'll do it again for sure.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.
Sounds good. All right. How can people get a hold of you or find you?
Um, I pulled the pin recently on Facebook, so I'm not on social media anymore. Now if people want to get a hold of me, they can go to, if you just go to my YouTube channel and you go
Mm-hmm.
to About, and you can prove you're not a robot, and just find my email through business inquiries or whatever, and I'd love to hear from people if they've got their own stories, they have
Sure.
something they think that I should know about, or if they have questions for me, that'd be nice. No worries. And if you're interested in buying my book, anyone, it's published by Flying Disc Press,
Mm-hmm.
Children of Orion: Finding the Cryptoterrestrials, and it's just on Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so
All
much.
right. Well, I thank you so much, and we will definitely get together and see if we get another day to get you back on to talk even more about this stuff. Because you touched on a lot of stuff, like with the Sierra sounds and all that. So, I mean, yeah, we could go on for hours.
Yeah, cool. Sounds like a plan, dude.
Okay, Ryan, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of the day, sir. Bye-bye. All right, that was really cool. In fact, I'm definitely going to get him on again because there's just so much I wanted to touch on tonight. But we have our hour thing going on. Thank you guys for coming tonight, and I really appreciate it. And if you can find it in your heart, you see my little ticker going down there, paypal.me at California Haunts. Everything for this show is out of my pocket, and I need help. I need help to keep this thing on the air and keep bringing in guests like Ryan to be on, to be on. So if you could find it in your heart to donate to paypal.me at California Haunts, that'd be great. The other issue we have is we have 97 subscribers on YouTube. So we're like around 4 away from where we need to be on over at YouTube. And once we get those extra subscribers and we maintain it for a while, they're going to let us have our own URL over there, so you can go directly over there to see our videos and stuff. Because right now, if you do a search, Google, whatever, you're not going to find our videos on YouTube. The best way to do that, to become a subscriber, is to go to the website at www.californiahauntsradio.com. Click on one of the YouTube, one of the videos there that'll take you to YouTube, and then you can subscribe. Because, like I said, we have 100 or more subscribers, and we maintain it for like a couple weeks, and then they're going to allow us to have a dedicated URL to YouTube, much like the one Ryan has. So you can go directly over there. You go to the website, and you're going to see all the archives that we've done for the last year and a half, 2 years are over there as well. But like I said, if you could find it in your heart to donate to the show, that would be wonderful. PayPal.me at California Haunts. All the money goes into the show. I don't use it for myself or anything like that. It's just to keep everything on the air, because it does get expensive, for mics and equipment and all this other stuff to maintain this. And I want to keep bringing these shows to you because I love doing it, because we do varying topics. It's not always paranormal. Like this week we got a lady coming on to talk about toxic foods on Wednesday. So it's going to be, we have different topics on here, and I think, you guys are interested in a lot of these things that I'm putting on. Anyway, again, if you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you didn't like the show, share it with 5 of your enemies. We're all equal opportunity here. And, because we're trying to get the word out more and more and more about this show. Okay? Again, I thank you guys for coming, and I'm going to go ahead and run Ryan's information about his books, where you can get his book and everything. And so here that is. Boom. Here we go. There we go. Children of Orion. And like he said, you can get that at Amazon.com. See? Shameless plug. Again, I want to thank you guys for coming, and we will be back tomorrow at 6:30. Our guest is we're going to have a different type of topic. Steroids and the harm that they can do to people, but mainly this gentleman that's going to be on, Max Stryker, who's going to be with us, used to work out, knew steroids, and he knew a doctor. I believe this is the way the story goes. Is he knew a doctor that was providing steroids to famous celebrities, and he has a book out. And in the book, he names names, and he's gone to court over this, and he's got proof. And he's, people like Sylvester Stallone and people like that. He even mentions The Rock and all this, and so he's going to be talking about steroids, who uses them, and the kind of issues that people have that use them. The kind of health issues that they cause and stuff like that. So that'll be tomorrow's show. Anyway, I will see you tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, and have a good evening.